The morning of January 5, 1943, Pacific Ocean, southwest of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Commander William Cochrane stood at the after 5-inch gun mount aboard the light cruiser USS Helena, watching 4 Japanese Val dive bombers retreat into the hazy tropical sky. The bombers had just attacked his task force, scoring a hit on the New Zealand cruiser Achilles. They were pulling away at maximum speed, confident they had escaped. Cochrane's gun crews had already loaded 3 shells into the breach. 2 were standard anti-aircraft rounds. 1 was something else entirely, something the Japanese had no idea existed. In the next 40 seconds, Cochrane would fire a weapon that would fundamentally alter the balance of air power in the Pacific War. The shell contained a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, 5 tiny vacuum tubes that had survived 20,000 gravities of acceleration, and a circuit that would detonate the projectile when it sensed an aircraft nearby. No timer, no direct hit required, just proximity. The second salvo detonated 70 feet from the nearest Val. The shrapnel cloud shredded the aircraft's engine and controls. The dive bomber rolled over and plunged into the ocean, trailing smoke and flame. The first kill achieved by America's proximity Fuze, the weapon that would make Japanese admirals understand they had already lost the war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why this single shell mattered so profoundly, you must understand what anti-aircraft warfare looked like before January 1943, and why every navy in the world considered it fundamentally broken. Traditional anti-aircraft gunnery relied on 2 types of fuses, mechanical time fuses and contact fuses. Both were inadequate against modern aircraft. A mechanical time fuse was set before, firing to explode at a predetermined time, theoretically when the shell reached the altitude where the target aircraft would be. The problem was obvious. Aircraft moved. They climbed, dove, accelerated, turned. Setting a fuse accurately required predicting exactly where a maneuvering target traveling 300 miles per hour would be 5 or 6 seconds in the future. Even with radar-controlled fire directors, which few ships possessed in early 1943, the mathematics were brutal. A gunner had to calculate the target's speed, altitude, heading, and rate of climb or descent, then factor in wind, shell ballistics, and the time lag between measurement and firing. Any error in prediction meant the shell exploded harmlessly, too high or too low, too far ahead or behind. The statistics told the story. Through 1942, American 5-inch guns firing time-fused ammunition required an average of 654 rounds to shoot down 1 Japanese aircraft. 654 shells, each weighing 55 pounds, each requiring careful fuse setting, each costing approximately $30, which in 1943 dollars represented real money. More importantly, each miss gave the attacking aircraft more time to press home its attack, to drop its bombs or torpedoes, to kill American sailors. Contact fuses offered no better solution. These fuses detonated only on physical impact with the target. Against a fighter or bomber traveling at combat speed, achieving direct hits was nearly impossible. The sky was too vast, the aircraft too small and maneuverable. Gunners described it as trying to hit a mosquito with a rifle bullet while both shooter and target were moving. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who commanded destroyers in the Solomon Islands campaign, would later write that mechanical time fuses brought down a plane at night only by accident. They were good for harassing enemy aircraft, but that was about all. The vulnerability of surface ships to air attack had become the defining problem of naval warfare. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese carrier aircraft had sunk 5 battleships in less than 2 hours. In May 1942, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, American anti-aircraft fire had proven inadequate against determined Japanese attack. In June, at Midway, the Japanese carriers had shot down dozens of American torpedo bombers, but only because the attacks came at low altitude, where even unguided weapons could saturate the airspace. High-altitude bombing remained essentially impossible to defend against, with existing anti-aircraft technology. The British understood this vulnerability acutely. In 1939, as war approached, British researchers began exploring proximity fuse concepts. They investigated acoustic fuses triggered by engine sound, photoelectric fuses activated by reflected light, electrostatic fuses that sensed changes in electrical fields. All showed promise in theory. None worked reliably in practice. The fundamental problem was engineering. An artillery shell fired from a 5-inch gun experienced acceleration forces of 20,000 times normal gravity. The shell left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. It spun at 25,000 revolutions per minute. Any fuse mechanism had to survive these forces, function reliably at temperatures ranging from Arctic cold to tropical heat, resist corrosion from salt spray, and detonate at precisely the right moment when the target was close enough for shrapnel to cause damage. Creating such a device seemed nearly impossible. The British lacked the industrial capacity to solve the problem. In September 1940, as part of the Tizard mission, they shared their early research with American scientists, hoping American engineering and manufacturing capability could succeed where British efforts had stalled. The United States Navy Bureau of Ordnance assigned the problem to Section T of the National Defense Research Committee, headquartered at the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism in Washington. Dr. Merle Tuve, a physicist who had pioneered radio technology, led the effort. Tuve understood the requirements. The fuse needed to be small enough to fit inside a 5-inch shell nose, rugged enough to survive gun firing, sensitive enough to detect aircraft at useful range, selective enough not to detonate prematurely from wave reflections or friendly aircraft, and simple enough to manufacture by the millions. The team explored multiple approaches. Photoelectric fuses using reflected light worked in laboratory conditions, but failed in combat scenarios with rain, clouds, or smoke. Acoustic fuses couldn't distinguish aircraft engines from other sounds. Electrostatic fuses lacked sufficient range. Only radio proximity fuses offered the combination of reliability and effectiveness needed. The principle was elegant. The fuse would contain a miniature radio transmitter broadcasting a continuous signal. When the signal reflected off a nearby aircraft, the fuse's receiver would detect the Doppler shift in frequency caused by relative motion between shell and target. When the frequency shift indicated the target was close enough for lethal effect, typically 60 to 70 feet, the fuse would trigger detonation. Theory was simple. Implementation was extraordinarily difficult. The fuse required 5 miniature vacuum tubes, each small enough to fit in a shell nose, each capable of surviving 20,000 times normal gravity. In 1940, such tubes did not exist. Standard radio tubes shattered instantly under gun-firing forces. Even hearing aid tubes, the smallest commercially available, couldn't withstand the acceleration. Western Electric Company and Sylvania worked to develop shock-resistant miniature tubes. The solution involved planar electrodes rather than wire filaments, special mounting techniques, and packing the tubes in wax to equalize stress during firing. By June 1941, prototype tubes could survive test firing. But survival was insufficient. The tubes had to function reliably after experiencing those forces. The battery presented another challenge. The fuse needed power, but standard batteries couldn't withstand firing acceleration. Engineers developed a special wet cell battery that activated only after the shell left the gun barrel, preventing premature arming and ensuring the fuse wouldn't explode near the firing ship. Safety features were critical. A fuse that detonated too close to the gun would kill the crew. A fuse that failed to detonate at all created the risk of enemy recovery and reverse engineering. American designers built in multiple safeguards. The battery required several milliseconds to activate, ensuring the shell traveled clear of the ship. The fuse wouldn't arm until the shell had spun up to minimum rotation speed, which occurred only after leaving the barrel. A self-destruct mechanism prevented duds from falling intact, where enemies might recover them. By August 1942, Section T had produced working prototypes reliable enough for testing. The Navy scheduled trials aboard the cruiser USS Cleveland in Chesapeake Bay. The test parameters were simple. Cleveland's guns would fire at radio-controlled drone aircraft maneuvering unpredictably. If the proximity fuzzes worked as designed, they should achieve hit rates far superior to time-fuzzed ammunition. The tests were scheduled for 2 days. They ended after the first morning. Cleveland's guns fired just 4 proximity-fuzzed shells at 3 target drones. All 3 drones were destroyed. The Navy immediately ordered mass production, but production at scale created new challenges. Each fuse contained approximately 130 miniaturized electronic components. 87 different companies operating 110 factories would eventually participate in manufacturing. Corporation in Cincinnati, selected for their experience in electrical and mechanical engineering, became the primary contractor. Crosley received their letter of intent in late November 1941, just days before Pearl Harbor. Their contract called for 500 fuzzes initially. By September 1942, the first production fuses came off Crosley's assembly lines. Production ramped slowly. By late 1942, factories were producing just 500 fuses per day. Quality control was critical. Every fuse was tested. Failures were analyzed. Improvements were implemented continuously. By late 1943, daily production exceeded 40,000 units. By war's end, production reached 70,000 fuses per day. More than 22 million proximity fuses would be manufactured before Japan surrendered. The weapons development had cost over $1 billion in 1940s currency, equivalent to roughly $15 billion today. Only the Manhattan Project and radar development received comparable investment. The secrecy surrounding the VT fuse, as it was codenamed, rivaled that of the atomic bomb. Variable time fuse was deliberate misdirection. The name suggested nothing about the actual mechanism, protecting against enemy intelligence efforts. Fuse distribution was carefully controlled. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, wanted the weapon tested in combat where its secrecy could best be protected. Ships that fell into enemy hands in the ocean depths, Japanese territory offered less risk of recovery than European battlefields where ground combat might expose unexploded shells to German scientists. In late December 1942, Commander Deke Parsons, a naval ordnance expert who had worked closely with Section T, received 5,000 Mark 32 proximity-fused shells and orders to deliver them personally to the Pacific. Parsons consulted with Admiral William Halsey, who commanded South Pacific forces. Halsey identified 3 ships most likely to encounter Japanese air attack: the cruiser Helena and the carriers Enterprise and Saratoga. Parsons loaded the special ammunition aboard those vessels, emphasizing to gunnery officers that these shells were experimental, highly classified, and absolutely could not fall into Japanese hands unexploded. The shells looked identical to standard ammunition, except for markings indicating special fuses. Gun crews were told only that these were improved anti-aircraft rounds that didn't require fuse setting. How they worked remained classified. Most sailors never learned the mechanism. They simply knew the funny fuse worked better than anything they'd fired before. Helena's encounter with Japanese Val dive bombers on January 5, 1943, demonstrated the weapon's potential. Lieutenant Commander Cochrane's second salvo, containing at least 1 proximity-fused shell, detonated near enough to the retreating bomber to shred its engine with shrapnel. The Val never had a chance to evade. The shell exploded when it came within lethal range, regardless of precise altitude or timing. Helena's gunnery report concluded that the value of the Mark 32 fused projectile could not be too highly stressed. The Bureau of Ordnance had been waiting for exactly this confirmation. Within weeks, production increased, and distribution expanded throughout the Pacific Fleet. The tactical implications were immediate and profound. Prior to proximity fuse, anti-aircraft gunners faced an impossible problem during coordinated attacks. Multiple aircraft approaching from different altitudes required different fuse settings for each target. Fire control computers struggled to manage simultaneous threats. Gunners had to set fuses manually, introducing delays that reduced firing rates. Any tactical error, any miscalculation, meant shells exploded uselessly while aircraft closed to attack range. Proximity fuzzes eliminated these problems. Gunners loaded shells without setting fuses. Fire control simply aimed the guns and fired. The shells automatically detonated when they sensed targets. This meant faster firing rates, simpler gunnery procedures, and dramatically improved effectiveness. The statistics confirmed the transformation. Through 1943, 9,128 rounds of 5-inch proximity-fused ammunition were fired in the Pacific. They shot down 61 aircraft. That translated to 155 rounds per kill. Compare that to 508 rounds per kill for time-fused shells during the same period. The proximity fuse was more than 3 times as effective. For Japanese aircrew, this improvement was deadly but not yet catastrophic. Experienced pilots could still press attacks home, accepting losses as the price of damaging American ships. Japanese doctrine emphasized fighting spirit and determination. Pilots were trained to complete their attacks even at the cost of their lives. Through 1943, this approach remained viable. American anti-aircraft defenses, while improving, could still be penetrated by skilled, determined attackers. But the Japanese pilot pool was finite. Every experienced aviator killed represented training and combat knowledge that could not be replaced quickly. Japan's pilot training programs, thorough and demanding, required years to produce combat-ready aircrew. American industrial capacity, by contrast, was producing proximity fuses at exponentially increasing rates. The asymmetry was already apparent to careful observers. Lieutenant Commander Nakio Nambu, who commanded one of Japan's massive I-400-class submarine aircraft carriers, would later tell American interrogators that the moment he understood Japan had lost the war came from overhearing American radio traffic during a patrol. The casual efficiency, the abundance of resources mentioned in routine communications, the sheer volume of coordinated operations across thousands of miles of ocean, all pointed to capabilities Japan simply couldn't match. But for most Japanese military personnel, the realization would come more gradually, through cumulative encounters with American technological advantages they couldn't explain and couldn't counter. The proximity fuse was among the most shocking of these technologies, because Japanese pilots had no idea it existed. They understood that American anti-aircraft fire was becoming more accurate. They attributed this to improved radar, better fire control, perhaps enhanced training. They had no concept that American shells were detonating automatically when they sensed aircraft nearby. The technology was beyond Japanese technical capabilities to imagine, let alone replicate. Through 1944, as American forces advanced across the Pacific, proximity fuse employment expanded. By mid-year, nearly every major combatant vessel in the Pacific Fleet carried proximity-fused ammunition. The improved Mark 40 and Mark 53 fuses offered greater sensitivity and reliability than early models. Effectiveness continued climbing. During 1944, 32,826 proximity-fused rounds were fired. They achieved 421 rounds per kill on average. The higher number reflected doctrinal changes. Fleet commanders, recognizing the fuse's effectiveness, ordered earlier engagement of targets. Ships opened fire at maximum range, 12,000 yards or more, using high percentages of proximity-fused ammunition. The goal shifted from conserving ammunition to preventing aircraft from reaching attack positions. American logistics could support this approach. Industrial production ensured adequate ammunition stocks. Ships restocking after combat operations received full loads, including generous allocations of proximity fuses. Japanese aircrew increasingly reported encountering walls of anti-aircraft fire at ranges where previously they'd faced only sporadic opposition. The sky filled with detonations tracking their approach. Shells exploded around them without apparent pattern, suggesting American gunners possessed uncanny prediction abilities. What Japanese pilots couldn't know was that American shells were hunting them autonomously. Each proximity-fused shell was a self-contained targeting system, sensing nearby aircraft and detonating for maximum effect. The psychological impact was significant but difficult to quantify. Japanese aircrew reported increasing stress from anti-aircraft fire. Mission success rates declined, losses mounted. By late 1944, Japanese naval air power had been severely depleted. The battles of the Philippine Sea in June and Leyte Gulf in October had destroyed hundreds of aircraft and killed thousands of trained pilots. Replacement pilots received abbreviated training, sometimes just months instead of the years earlier aviators had received. These newer pilots lacked the skill to press attacks through intense anti-aircraft fire. They broke off approaches too early, dropped weapons inaccurately, or fell victim to defensive fire before reaching their targets. Bomb and torpedo hit rates declined to single-digit percentages. The Japanese High Command faced a crisis. Conventional attacks were failing. Pilot quality had degraded so severely that normal tactics were no longer viable. American combat air patrols, radar-directed fighter interception, and devastating anti-aircraft fire created defenses that inexperienced pilots simply couldn't penetrate. Something radical was required. In October 1944, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commanding 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, proposed institutionalizing what desperate pilots had already begun doing individually: deliberate suicide attacks, kamikaze. The term meant divine wind, referencing a legendary typhoon that had destroyed a firm Mongol invasion fleet in the 13th century. The concept was straightforward. Pilots would load their aircraft with explosives and deliberately crash into American ships. Success required only that the pilot keep his aircraft flying until impact. No need to maneuver for bomb release, no requirement for torpedo run precision. Just aim the entire aircraft at the target and maintain control until collision. The tactic emerged from desperation, but possessed brutal logic. An inexperienced pilot who couldn't execute a proper dive-bombing attack could still fly straight at a ship. The Americans couldn't afford to let even one kamikaze through, because a single hit could sink a destroyer or cripple a carrier. The defenders had to achieve perfect interception. The attackers only needed occasional success. The first organized kamikaze attacks occurred on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. 6-0 fighters loaded with 250-kilogram bombs struck a formation of escort carriers east of Samar Island. The escort carrier St. Lo was hit by a kamikaze that penetrated to the hangar deck. Secondary explosions from armed aircraft and aviation fuel tore the ship apart. St. Lo sank in 30 minutes. 113 men died. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The success shocked American commanders. Kamikazes were achieving hit rates far higher than conventional attacks. Through the Philippines campaign, between October 1944 and January 1945, an estimated 650 Japanese aircraft conducted kamikaze attacks. Of 364 kamikazes that reached American ships, anti-aircraft guns claimed 231 kills and deflections, a 64% success rate, but that meant 133 kamikazes got through. Against escort carriers, destroyers, and other vessels with limited anti-aircraft armament, the results were devastating. For the Navy, this was the anti-aircraft problem reaching its ultimate expression. Kamikazes closed at maximum speed on straight-line trajectories. They gave defenders minimal time to react. Fire control systems designed to track maneuvering bombers struggled with targets deliberately flying straight at the ship. The shortened engagement time meant fewer shots fired before the kamikaze either hit or passed overhead. Even proximity fuses showed reduced effectiveness. Statistics from October 1944 through January 1945 illustrated the challenge. Against kamikaze attacks, 5-inch guns firing proximity-fused ammunition required 310 rounds per aircraft destroyed. That compared favorably to 1,162 rounds per kill using time-fused ammunition, but it was still concerningly high. The kamikazes' straight-line approach meant less time for the shell's fuse to sense the target. Many kamikazes were hit multiple times but maintained enough control to complete their crashes. 40mm and 20mm guns, closer-range weapons with high firing rates, actually achieved better results against kamikazes than against conventional attacks. These lighter guns accounted for 46.8% and 31.8% of kamikazes destroyed, respectively. The 5-inch guns, despite proximity fuses, claimed just 15.8% of kills. The implication was clear. Kamikazes had to be stopped at range before they closed to the point where only light weapons could engage. This required earlier detection, more firepower, and improved coordination between ships in formation. The Navy responded with doctrinal and technological adaptations. Destroyer radar pickets were positioned forward of carrier task groups, extending detection range and providing early warning. These destroyers, equipped with the latest radar and enhanced anti-aircraft armament, would detect incoming raids and direct combat air patrols to intercept. If aircraft penetrated the fighter screen, the picket destroyers would engage with all weapons, including proximity-fused 5-inch shells fired at maximum range. Fast carrier task groups developed anti-aircraft coordination plans. Multiple ships would concentrate fire on single targets, creating overlapping fields of fire that maximized hit probability. Fire control systems were linked through radio, allowing coordinated targeting. New gun directors were rushed into production. The Mark 57 and Mark 63 directors offered blind firing capability, allowing guns to track targets using radar alone without visual contact. This meant engagement in darkness, through clouds, or at ranges where visual tracking was impossible. The Mark 53 proximity fuse, introduced in late 1944, provided enhanced sensitivity with an operational radius of 100 feet, compared to 60 feet for earlier models. Improved fragmentation patterns increased lethality. New safety features reduced arming range to 500 yards, while maintaining protection against premature detonation. Production continued accelerating. By early 1945, factories were producing proximity fuses faster than ships could expend them. Stockpiles accumulated at forward bases. Every major vessel received generous allocations. Doctrine emphasized firing proximity fuses almost exclusively, reserving time-fused ammunition only for spotting purposes. Since proximity fuses produced no visible burst, and gunners couldn't tell where they were aiming without some visible reference. Fleet training emphasized volume of fire. Engage early, engage often, fire at everything that approached. American logistics could support this approach. Japanese logistics could not. Every aircraft lost was irreplaceable. Every experienced pilot killed represented knowledge that died with him. As American forces prepared for the invasion of Okinawa in March 1945, intelligence predicted the kamikaze threat would intensify. Okinawa lay just 350 miles from the Japanese home islands of Kyushu. Japanese airfields on Kyushu could launch attacks with minimal warning. The island's strategic importance made it a target the Japanese would defend with everything available. Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet included approximately 1,500 ships supporting the invasion force. The kamikaze threat would focus primarily on these ships, particularly the vulnerable amphibious vessels and destroyer pickets. The Navy knew the battle would test American anti-aircraft capabilities like never before. Proximity fuses would be essential, but even the improved fuses had limitations. A kamikaze diving at 400 miles per hour gave defenders perhaps 30 seconds from detection to impact. Fire control computers calculated firing solutions, guns tracked targets, shells flew toward their targets. But the kamikaze kept coming, absorbing damage, sometimes flying through multiple shell detonations before either disintegrating or striking the ship. The statistics from the Philippines had been sobering. Against determined kamikaze attacks, proximity fuses were effective but not decisive. They increased kill rates, they saved ships, they reduced casualties. But they couldn't guarantee complete protection. Admiral Spruance understood this. Every ship in his fleet would face the kamikaze threat. Some would be hit, some would sink. The question was whether American anti-aircraft defenses were good enough to prevent catastrophic losses. The answer would become clear on April 6, 1945, when the first Kikisui, floating chrysanthemum, attack struck the Okinawa invasion fleet. 355 Japanese aircraft launched from Kyushu airfields in the early morning hours of April 6, 1945. 230 of them were kamikazes, 125 were escorts, and conventional attackers meant to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers. The largest coordinated suicide attack ever attempted. Their targets were the American ships surrounding Okinawa, particularly the destroyer radar pickets positioned north and west of the island. These destroyers formed the outer defensive ring, early warning posts equipped with the most advanced radar available. They would detect the incoming raid first. They would face the attack first. They would die first if American defenses failed. Destroyer Picket Station No. 1, positioned 40 miles northwest of Okinawa, consisted of 2 destroyers and 4 landing craft support ships. The destroyers Bush and Colquhoun carried the standard armament for their class. 5 5-inch guns, multiple 40mm and 20mm mounts, the latest radar, and magazines loaded with proximity-fused ammunition. Their radar operators detected the incoming raid at 0830 hours. Dozens of contacts approaching from the north. Combat air patrol fighters were vectored to intercept. The destroyers went to general quarters. Gun crews loaded proximity fuses. Fire control radars locked onto targets. Within 20 minutes, the first kamikazes appeared. What followed was 90 minutes of sustained combat that would demonstrate both the effectiveness and limitations of American anti-aircraft technology. Bush's 5-inch guns opened fire at 12,000 yards. The maximum effective range. Proximity-fused shells detonated in the path of the approaching aircraft. The first kamikaze, a Zero fighter loaded with a bomb, disintegrated in a fireball of burning fuel and torn metal. The second kamikaze pressed through the flak. Bush's 40mm guns engaged. Tracers converged on the diving aircraft. Hits sparkled along the fuselage and wings. The Zero kept coming. Impact! The kamikaze struck Bush amidships, penetrating to the forward engine room. The bomb detonated below decks, bulkheads collapsed, steam lines ruptured, men died in the explosion and burning fuel. Bush lost power and steering, but her guns kept firing. Manually aimed, manually loaded, crews working damaged weapons continued engaging targets. 3 more kamikazes attacked Bush over the next hour. 2 were destroyed by proximity-fused fire. 1 got through, striking near the bridge. A 4th kamikaze hit the forward 5-inch magazine. The resulting explosion broke Bush's back. She sank within minutes. Colquhoun fought alongside Bush until the end. Her 5-inch guns, all equipped with proximity fuses, fired continuously. The ship's action report would later record that proximity fuses performed excellently, destroying multiple kamikazes at ranges where conventional ammunition would have been useless. But volume overwhelmed defenses. Colquhoun absorbed 4 kamikaze hits in 45 minutes. The destroyer was abandoned and later sank. Between them, Bush and Colquhoun had shot down an estimated 18 kamikazes before succumbing to sustained attack. The mathematics were brutal. 2 destroyers, equipped with the best anti-aircraft technology America could produce, firing proximity fuses at maximum rate, destroyed perhaps 20 aircraft. But 6 got through. 6 was enough. Across the Okinawa area that day, kamikazes sank 3 destroyers and damaged 10 more vessels. American ships expended thousands of proximity-fused shells. The fuses worked exactly as designed, detonating near targets, creating lethal fragment clouds. But the kamikazes kept coming. Some were destroyed, some were damaged and crashed short. Some hit their targets. The April 6th attack demonstrated what Japanese commanders had already concluded. Proximity fuses made American anti-aircraft fire devastatingly effective, but they hadn't made American ships invulnerable. If Japan was willing to accept catastrophic aircraft losses, kamikazes could penetrate even the most sophisticated defenses. The question was whether Japan could sustain such losses long enough to force America to negotiate. The answer would be written in the statistics that accumulated over the following months. Between April and June 1945, Japan launched 10 major Kikisui operations, plus hundreds of smaller attacks. Approximately 1,500 aircraft were expended as kamikazes. American ships fired nearly two-thirds of all proximity fuses used during the entire war in just those 3 months. 200 aircraft were confirmed destroyed by proximity-fused shells alone. The fuse's effectiveness was undeniable. Analysis showed that without proximity fuses, American losses at Okinawa would have been catastrophically higher. Time-fused ammunition would have allowed 4 to 6 times more kamikazes to penetrate defenses. Entire task groups might have been destroyed. The invasion fleet might have been forced to withdraw, but effectiveness came at a cost. American industry could sustain, and Japanese industry could not. The United States was producing proximity fuses at 70,000 per day. Japan was losing aircraft faster than training programs could replace them. Experienced pilots were dead. Replacement crews received minimal training before being assigned to kamikaze units. Aircraft quality deteriorated as Japan's aircraft industry struggled with material shortages and bombing damage. By June 1945, some kamikaze attacks involved trainers and obsolete aircraft pressed into service because nothing else was available. American anti-aircraft gunners reported destroying kamikazes that seemed barely airworthy, held together with improvised repairs, flown by pilots who struggled to maintain formation. The technological and industrial disparity had become overwhelming. Japan's military leadership understood this reality. They had understood it for months, perhaps years. But understanding defeat and accepting defeat were different. Japanese doctrine, Japanese culture, Japanese military honor demanded fighting to the end. Surrender was unthinkable. Negotiated peace from a position of weakness was impossible. So the war continued. Kamikazes kept flying. American ships kept firing proximity fuses. Men died on both sides. The question was no longer whether Japan would lose, but how long defeat would take and how many would die before surrender came. For Japanese personnel who survived to become prisoners, the realization of technological inferiority was profound and demoralizing. Interrogations conducted after Japan's surrender revealed consistent themes. Japanese military personnel expressed shock at American industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and resource abundance. They described feeling overwhelmed not by individual weapons but by entire systems, radar networks that detected aircraft hundreds of miles away, fighter direction systems that coordinated interceptions across vast areas, anti-aircraft weapons that seemed to track targets automatically, ships that survived damage that would have sunk equivalent Japanese vessels. Logistics networks that kept every unit supplied with ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts. One captured Japanese naval officer when shown a proximity fuse cut open to reveal its internal components. Reportedly stated that if Japan had possessed such weapons, the war might have had a different outcome. American interrogators explained the development timeline. Work began in 1940, first combat use in January 1943. Mass production by mid-1943. Millions produced by 1945. The Japanese officer's response was telling. He said Japan couldn't have developed such a weapon during the war. The miniaturized vacuum tubes alone represented technology Japan didn't possess. The manufacturing capacity to produce millions of units was beyond Japanese industry, even before American bombing disrupted production. The quality control required to ensure reliability in mass-produced complex devices was something Japan had never achieved. He said the proximity fuse represented not just a weapon, but an entire industrial and technological system that Japan simply couldn't match. This understanding, replicated across thousands of Japanese prisoners, represented a psychological defeat as complete as any battlefield loss. The realization that Japan had been fighting an enemy whose technological and industrial advantages were so overwhelming that defeat was inevitable regardless of Japanese courage, skill, or determination. Some Japanese officers drew explicit comparisons to the Meiji Restoration, when 19th-century Japan had recognized Western technological superiority and embarked on rapid modernization. They suggested post-war Japan would need similar transformation, learning from American technological excellence rather than resisting it. These attitudes would influence post-war Japanese development. Former military personnel, including naval officers who had experienced American technological superiority firsthand, took positions in Japanese industry. They brought lessons learned through defeat, emphasis on quality control, integrated systems, continuous improvement, technological competition. Companies like Sony, Toyota, Honda would incorporate former military personnel who understood that technological excellence required more than good ideas. It required reliable production, systematic quality assurance, complete system integration. The proximity fuse, in this sense, influenced post-war Japanese industrial philosophy as much through defeat as it influenced wartime naval combat through effectiveness. But that was future history, invisible to the men fighting at Okinawa in the spring of 1945. For them, the reality was more immediate: ships burning, men dying, kamikazes diving through walls of fire, proximity-fused shells detonating in the sky. The battle continued through April, May, June. American casualties mounted. 26 ships sunk, including 12 destroyers. 164 ships damaged, nearly 5,000 sailors killed, another 5,000 wounded, the worst sustained losses the Navy experienced in any single campaign. But Japanese losses were catastrophic. Approximately 4,000 aircraft destroyed, most of the pilots killed. The cream of what remained of Japanese naval and army air forces, obliterated against American defenses they couldn't penetrate consistently enough to force American withdrawal. The proximity fuse hadn't prevented Japanese attacks, but it had ensured those attacks cost more than Japan could afford. Every kamikaze that exploded in mid-air from proximity-fused shells was an aircraft that couldn't hit a ship. Every pilot killed approaching the fleet was experience and training lost forever. The cumulative effect was decisive. By July 1945, Japan's ability to contest American naval operations had effectively ceased. Kamikaze attacks continued on a smaller scale, but organized resistance was collapsing. When Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet approached the Japanese home islands in mid-July and began bombardment operations with impunity, Japanese inability to respond demonstrated how thoroughly air power had been depleted. The few aircraft that attacked were destroyed by combat air patrols or proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire before reaching targets. On August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. On August 9, Nagasaki. Between those dates, the Soviet Union declared war and invaded Manchuria. Japan's strategic position had become completely hopeless. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that most Japanese citizens had never heard their emperor's voice before. The war was over. In the immediate aftermath, as American occupation forces arrived in Japan and began the process of demobilization, Japanese military personnel provided extensive information to American intelligence. These interrogations produced detailed assessments of Japanese perceptions of American technology. The proximity fuse featured prominently in these discussions. Japanese officers acknowledged they had been aware that American anti-aircraft effectiveness had increased dramatically, starting in 1943. They attributed this initially to improved radar and fire control. The concept of a self-detonating shell that sensed nearby aircraft was considered but dismissed as technically improbable. When American interrogators explained how proximity fuses actually worked, using miniature radio transmitters and receivers inside each shell, Japanese reaction ranged from disbelief to resignation. The technology represented capabilities Japan had not considered possible to deploy operationally. One admiral, whose name was recorded in interrogation reports as Admiral Fukudomi, when informed about the proximity fuse's development timeline and production numbers, reportedly stated that this single weapon exemplified why Japan had lost the war. He explained that Japan could produce individual examples of advanced technology. Japanese engineers were capable, but Japan couldn't integrate multiple technologies into complete systems and then manufacture those systems at industrial scale. He specifically cited the proximity fuse as combining miniature electronics, radio technology, shock-resistant design, automated manufacturing, and quality control into a weapon produced by the millions. Japan, he said, could have managed perhaps one or two of those requirements. Achieving all of them simultaneously was beyond Japanese capability. This statement would later be remembered as emblematic of Japanese recognition that the war had been lost not through lack of courage, but through industrial and technological inferiority. The Americans hadn't won because their sailors were braver or their commanders more skilled. They won because American industry could produce weapons Japan couldn't match and sustain operations Japan couldn't maintain. The specific numbers reinforced this conclusion. During World War II, the United States produced approximately 15 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and dozens of escort carriers. Total carrier production exceeded 100 ships. Japan produced 25 carriers of all types during the entire war. American shipyards could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. American industry produced over 22 million proximity fuzzes. Japan produced 0 comparable weapons. American factories manufactured aircraft by the tens of thousands. Japan's aircraft production peaked at 2,000 per month and declined thereafter as materials became scarce and facilities were bombed. The industrial disparity was so vast that individual battles, individual weapons, individual tactical innovations couldn't overcome it. Japan could win tactical victories. Japanese forces did win battles, did inflict losses, did demonstrate skill and determination. But winning individual battles while losing the industrial competition meant slow, inevitable defeat. The proximity fuse embodied this reality. It was a single weapon among many, but it represented systematic advantages Japan couldn't counter. American scientific research translated into practical weapons. American industrial capacity manufactured those weapons at scale. American logistics delivered them to combat zones. American doctrine integrated them into effective defensive systems. Every link in that chain functioned effectively. Break any link, and the system failed. The proximity fuse succeeded because every supporting system worked. Japanese military personnel studying American capabilities after surrender understood this lesson viscerally. They had experienced technological inferiority. They had fought knowing their weapons were outmatched. They had watched comrades die in attacks that should have succeeded but failed because American defenses were simply better. These lessons shaped post-war attitudes. When American occupation authorities began reconstruction, many former Japanese military personnel embraced the opportunity to learn from American technology and industry. They saw defeat not as permanent national humiliation but as opportunity for transformation. Japan had been defeated by superior technology and industry. Therefore, Japan must develop superior technology and industry. This mindset would drive Japan's post-war economic miracle. The nation that lost World War II would become an industrial powerhouse by the 1970s and 80s. Former enemies would become economic competitors and eventually partners. The transformation was remarkable, but built on lessons learned through defeat. One of those lessons was the proximity fuse and what it represented. A weapon that seemed impossible became operational through systematic application of science, engineering, and industrial capacity. Japan would spend decades learning to match and eventually exceed American capabilities in specific industries: electronics, automobiles, manufacturing quality, process optimization. The student would become the teacher in some areas. But in 1945, those futures were unimaginable. Japan was defeated, occupied, struggling with devastation. The proximity fuse was among the weapons that had ensured that defeat. For the American sailors who had fought the kamikaze attacks at Okinawa, the proximity fuse represented something simpler. It meant survival. The shell that detonated automatically when it sensed a kamikaze diving toward your ship. The weapon that increased your chances of shooting down the attacker before he hit. Not a guarantee, men still died. Ships still sank. But the odds were better with proximity fuses than without. Admiral Ali Burke, reflecting on the Okinawa campaign years later, stated that proximity fuses knocked down enemy planes by the dozens. He credited the weapon with saving countless lives and ships. Without proximity fuses, he said, the Navy's losses at Okinawa would have been unsustainable. The campaign might have failed. The invasion of Japan's home islands might have been delayed or cancelled. The war might have lasted months or years longer. These counterfactuals are impossible to prove. History took the path it took, but the statistics support Burke's assessment. Proximity fuses were 3 to 6 times more effective than conventional ammunition depending on tactical situation. That multiplier applied across thousands of engagements meant thousands more aircraft destroyed, thousands more attacks defeated, dozens more ships saved. The mathematical certainty was simple. More effective anti-aircraft fire meant fewer successful attacks, meant fewer ships sunk, meant fewer sailors killed. The proximity fuse, developed in laboratories, manufactured in factories, delivered to ships, fired in combat, detonating automatically when it sensed nearby aircraft, embodied American industrial and technological power applied to solving military problems. It wasn't the only decisive weapon. Radar was equally important. Code breaking was crucial. Aircraft carriers, submarines, logistics, all contributed. But the proximity fuse represented something psychologically important. It was technology that worked exactly as designed. A problem identified, researched, solved, manufactured at scale, deployed effectively. The system functioned. That consistency, that reliability, that systematic effectiveness was what Japanese admirals recognized after the war as the decisive difference. Japan could produce brilliant individual weapons. The Zero fighter had been world-class in 1941. Japanese torpedoes were technically superior to American torpedoes throughout the war. Individual Japanese ships, individual units, individual commanders demonstrated excellence repeatedly. But excellence in isolated examples couldn't overcome systematic advantages across every domain. The proximity fuse was systematic advantage made manifest. Every major American ship carried them. Millions were available. Doctrine integrated them effectively. Training ensured proper use. Logistics kept them supplied. Quality control ensured reliability. The entire system functioned as designed. When Japanese admirals said we lost after seeing the proximity fuse in action, they weren't speaking literally. Most Japanese admirals never saw proximity fuses directly. They saw the effect. Aircraft destroyed at ranges previously considered safe. Anti-aircraft fire more accurate than anything they'd experienced. Defensive systems that seemed impossible to penetrate consistently. The specific weapon was less important than what it represented. An enemy whose technological sophistication and industrial capacity created advantages at every level. Advantages that accumulated into overwhelming superiority. Advantages that made Japanese defeat mathematically inevitable, regardless of courage, skill, or determination. This understanding, this psychological recognition of inferiority, not in spirit but in capability, was the real defeat. Military forces can accept tactical losses, strategic setbacks, even significant defeats, if they believe eventual victory remains possible. But when defeat becomes mathematically certain, when every projection shows inevitable loss, when the enemy's advantages compound faster than your own forces can adapt, then defeat becomes not just likely but predetermined. Japanese military leadership reached this conclusion at different times. Some understood it after Midway, some after the Marianas Turkey shoot, some after the Philippines, some only after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But by war's end, the understanding was universal. Japan had been fighting an unwinnable war against an enemy whose advantages were overwhelming. The proximity fuse was one weapon among many that demonstrated this reality. It was the shell that made Japanese admirals understand the ocean belonged to those who controlled the technology to master it. From Helena's first kill in January 1943 to the last proximity-fused shells fired in August 1945, the weapon had shot down more than 250 Japanese aircraft confirmed, with many more probable kills. It had contributed to defensive systems that broke up kamikaze attacks, protected invasion fleets, enabled offensive operations that brought American forces to Japan's doorstep. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal would write that the proximity fuse had helped blaze the trail to Japan. Without the protection this ingenious device had given the surface ships of the fleet, the westward push could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater. That assessment was accurate, but understated the weapon's psychological impact. The proximity fuse had demonstrated to Japanese military personnel that they were fighting an enemy whose technological advantages were not temporary or limited, but systematic and decisive. This understanding, replicated across thousands of Japanese personnel who experienced American capabilities directly, shaped post-war attitudes and influenced Reconstruction. The weapon that shot down aircraft also shot down illusions about Japanese technological parity. The result was a nation that embraced technological competition as the path forward. Japan would rebuild by learning from the enemy that had defeated it. By the 1980s, Japan would produce electronics, automobiles, and manufactured goods that competed successfully with American products. The transformation from defeated empire to economic powerhouse was built on lessons learned through technological defeat. The proximity fuse was among the teachers, not through its design, which remained classified for years, but through its effects. Through the demonstration that systematic application of science, engineering, and industrial capacity could produce weapons that changed warfare fundamentally. That lesson, learned through defeat by one generation, would drive success in Reconstruction by the next. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.